In October last year, a Lion Air Boeing 737 MAX had only been in the air for 12 minutes after taking off from Jakarta Airport when it crashed into the Java Sea. All 189 passengers and crew on board were killed. After the initial days of the crash, Boeing questioned the abilities of the Indonesian crew. Just 5 months later, in March this year, an Ethiopian Air Boeing 737 MAX took off from Addis Ababa and was only in the air for 6 minutes before crashing near a small village. All 157 passengers and crew on board were killed. Investigations and government agencies around the world scrambled to figure out what had happened as cries for the grounding of this 737 MAX grew louder. Australia, China and Indonesia were amongst the first countries to ground their 737 MAX fleets, and they were followed by the United Kingdom, Singapore, Canada and eventually the United States after the Trump administration succumbed to public pressure. Around the world, the 737 MAX remains grounded. Boeing has had a $6 billion aircraft contract cancelled, and the global manufacturing industry has seen a 25% downturn in aircraft production this year. Let's also consider Nokia, who invented the very first smartphone in the 1990s. And if you're anything like me, your first phone was probably a Nokia, although you've most likely got an iPhone in your pocket now. In the late 1990s, Nokia had a 23% world market share of mobile phones, yet that declined to 3% in a number of years. The company lost 90% of their market cap, and by 2013 conceded defeat, and they were sold to Microsoft. Yet in 1865, Nokia had actually begun life as a paper mill in Finland, so they'd always been an exemplar of strategic agility. However, Nokia's strategy had not been nimble enough or innovative enough to keep up with the changing technology landscape around them. They simply could not prevent the rise of the iPhone, despite spending $5 billion a year on R&D. Nokia was unable to translate all of that R&D spend into products that people actually wanted to buy. Well, let's think about Wells Fargo, an American bank that's 160 years old. At one point, Wells Fargo had the biggest market value of all banks in the US. It was the 7th largest company in the world, and it was rated as one of the world's most respected companies. But all that disappeared quickly after the bank in the early 2000s adopted a cross-selling campaign they called Going for Great. I'm sure the advertising person thought they were very clever. Great spelt GR8, because the campaign motivated employees to sell on average a previously unheard of 8 products per customer. Incentive schemes were put in place, metrics tracked and ambitious sales targets set. The program was a huge success. By 2010, the CEO boasted in his letter to shareholders that the company was the king of cross-sell, as it averaged 6 products per customer when the industry average was 2. However, by 2016, the ticking time bomb inside the bank had exploded. The CEO had resigned. The bank had been found guilty of widespread misconduct and they'd been fined more than $1 billion. 2 million unauthorised customer accounts had been opened, and thousands upon thousands of credit cards, products and services had been sold to customers under false pretences. Now, why are these 3 stories relevant in a room full of leaders from the property industry? They are all about corporate failures, of course, but for seemingly different reasons: an engineering failure at Boeing, an ineffective strategy at Nokia, and the actions of unscrupulous employees at Wells Fargo. But what we're going to discover is that regardless of the industry context in which those failures occurred, they also shared very common features as a result of years, or decades even, of cultures, leadership styles and management pressures, which frankly can happen in any company, in any industry, and to any leader. What all of these examples have in common was a failure by their organisation's leaders to understand the cultures they had created, often with good intentions, but with powerful consequences that led to disastrous outcomes. In each case, the leaders had all been bold in their goals, but the behaviours they used to achieve them had doomed them to fail. Business failures like these contribute, along with royal commissions, failures of political leadership, widespread examples of fraud and corruption, to the significant decline in trust within our community towards institutions, including government, media, but also businesses generally and business leaders more specifically. And when I'm talking about leaders this morning, it doesn't matter what your position title might be, whether you're the CEO or a team supervisor. We are all leaders in our teams and environments. We all have an impact on those around us and the culture that we develop, regardless of what it might say in our business cards. In the property and construction industry in particular, I think there's a much greater focus than any other industry that I've been involved in around the legacy that we leave. The industry depends on bold leadership. Name me a civil engineer who hasn't proudly pointed out a bridge they might have designed, or a property developer who hasn't proudly talked of a building they might have been behind that's helped shape a city skyline. The work you do has tangible impacts for generations. We see entire communities now being designed which focus on improving the lives of future generations, as well as for the environment. We know there's a tremendous focus by our industry on infrastructure and ensuring it meets the needs of Australians, not just in the next few years, but in the decades to come. And I think the property industry can and does lead the way in this regard. So this morning, I'm really hoping that we can apply that same focus and frame around thinking about the legacy that we leave to your own personal leadership. We're going to think a little closer to home than the people that fill our buildings and cities, and instead think about the people that you work alongside of every single day, who collaborate and innovate with you and help you to be the leading edge leaders that I'm sure you are. What legacy as a leader are you leaving them? I'm sure I'm not telling you anything you don't already know when I say there's a crisis of trust towards business. It's hard to escape the daily headlines. We talk a lot about the loss of trust in institutions, but of course every institution is just made up of a collection of individuals. So that's what I want to focus on today, the role that we as individual leaders play in an organisation and what we can do to build and retain trust. So let's look at some new data now from the Edelman Trust Barometer, which I'm sure many of you would be familiar with. And some of the results that have come out this year are really interesting for us as leaders. Now, for those who don't know, the Edelman Trust Barometer is done every single year, and it interviews 33,000 people from 27 countries around the world. 84% of the respondents are from the general population, but 16% are from the informed public, which I like to think is pretty much the demographic of this room. That means you're aged 25 to 64, university educated, in the top 25% of household incomes in your market, and you report significant media consumption and interest in public policy and business news. Now, the first result I wanted to share here with you today relates to the extent to which respondents rate people speaking about a company as very or extremely credible. So this is all about credibility, but of course that's closely related to trust. Now, you can see at the top of the scale the highest result, which were company technical experts. And so they were rated by respondents, by 65% of respondents, as very or extremely credible. Now, I'm first up this morning, so we're going to do a little bit of an exercise, and it's a big room. All you're going to have to do is raise your hands. But I want you to think about where a CEO would rate on this scale. So you've got 4 choices, and I want you to raise your hand when I reach the number that you think the CEO would sit relative to the company technical expert. So who thinks a CEO might rate number 1? So quite high on the scale. We've got a couple of people. Any others for number 1? Great. Number 2. Have we got any for 2? Quite a few more. Right. Number 3. A lot more. I'm not sure what this is saying about your CEOs. And number 4. Few less. All right. Well, you're right. So CEOs rated at the lower end of the scale with only 47%, less than half of respondents believing that what they were saying was very credible.